My stepmom made my life hell and convinced my dad to send me away. Years later, he shows up at my door begging for forgiveness. I never thought I'd be sharing my story like this, but I need advice. I'm Lena, 17F, and my life has been a roller coaster of family drama that I never asked for. It all started when I was 8. Up until then, we were what I thought was a happy family. Me, my dad, Kevin, 45M, and my mom, Peggy, 43F. We lived in a cozy little house in the suburbs with a yard where Dad would push me on the swing he built himself. Mom worked as a real estate agent and Dad was a high school teacher. They both doted on me, their only child. I remember the day everything changed. It was a sunny Saturday in April. We were supposed to go to the park for a picnic, a family tradition we'd had since I was little. I woke up excited, rushing downstairs with my favorite stuffed bear, ready for our day out. But when I got to the kitchen, I found Dad sitting at the table, his head in his hands. Mom was nowhere to be seen. Dad looked up when I came in, and I'll never forget the look on his face. A mix of sadness, anger, and something else I couldn't quite place. He told me Mom had left, just packed her bags and disappeared in the middle of the night. No note, no explanation. Just gone. I didn't understand at first. I thought maybe she'd gone on a trip and forgot to tell us. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the reality set in. Mom wasn't coming back. Those first few years were tough. Dad did his best, but he was struggling too. He'd come home from work exhausted, trying to balance his job with being a single parent. I learned to cook simple meals and do laundry at a young age, wanting to help out however I could. We were a team, Dad and me, against the world. As I got older, I started asking more questions about Mom. Why did she leave? Where did she go? Dad never had many answers. He'd just shake his head and say, "Sometimes people make choices we can't understand, Lena." It wasn't much, but it was all I had. Things started to look up when I was 12. Dad got a promotion at school, becoming the head of the English department. We were finally able to take a vacation that summer, a week at the beach. It was the first time I'd seen Dad truly relax in years, but our peace was short-lived. When I was 14, Dad met Melissa, 39F, at a school fundraiser. She was a parent volunteer, recently divorced with 2 kids of her own, Zach, 10M, and Maria, 8F. At first, I was happy for Dad. He deserved to find love again after everything he'd been through. Melissa seemed nice enough in the beginning. She'd come over for dinner, bringing homemade desserts and always asking about my day at school. She even helped me pick out an outfit for my first school dance. I thought maybe, just maybe, we could be a family again. But things changed quickly after Melissa and her kids moved in with us, just 6 months after she and Dad started dating. Our cozy 3-bedroom house suddenly felt cramped and chaotic. I had to share my room with Maria, while Zach got the spare room to himself. When I complained about the lack of privacy, Melissa just said I should be grateful they even took me in. Her words stung. This had been my home long before it was hers. Over time, Melissa's true colors started to show. She favored her own kids in ways that were impossible to ignore. New clothes, the latest gadgets, trips to the mall. Zach and Maria got it all, while I was left with hand-me-downs and excuses about tight budgets. She'd take them out for ice cream or to the movies, conveniently forgetting to invite me along. Dad was working longer hours now to support our larger family, so he wasn't around much to see what was happening. When he was home, Melissa was all smiles and sweetness, but the moment he left for work, her demeanor would change. She'd bark orders at me, piling on chores while her own kids played video games or watched TV. The worst part was how she treated Dad when she thought no one was listening. I'd overhear her criticizing everything about him, from the way he dressed to how he parented me. She'd make snide comments about how he couldn't provide for his family like her ex-husband could. I could see it was wearing Dad down, but he never said anything. I think he was so afraid of being alone again that he was willing to put up with almost anything. As the months went by, I felt more and more like an outsider in my own home. I threw myself into my studies and extracurricular activities, anything to stay out of the house as much as possible. I joined the school newspaper, the debate club, even the soccer team. Despite being terribly uncoordinated, anything was better than being at home with Melissa's constant jabs and thinly veiled insults. I tried talking to Dad about it a few times, but he always brushed it off. Melissa's just adjusting to being a mom to a teenager, he'd say, or, I'm sure she doesn't mean anything by it. It was like he couldn't, or wouldn't, see what was happening right under his nose. Things came to a head last week. It was my 17th birthday, and I had been dropping hints about a concert I wanted to go to for months. My favorite band was playing in the city, and it felt like a rite of passage. My first big concert without parental supervision. I'd even saved up my babysitting money to buy the ticket myself. On the morning of my birthday, I came downstairs, half expecting at least a happy birthday from Melissa. Instead, I found her in the kitchen, excitedly telling Zach and Maria about the surprise trip to a water park she'd planned for them that weekend. It was the same water park I had begged to go to when I was younger, but we could never afford it. When I cleared my throat, reminding them it was my birthday, Melissa just shrugged and said, "Oh, I forgot. Maybe next year we can do something special." I lost it. Years of pent-up frustration and hurt came pouring out. I yelled at her, calling her out for all the favoritism and mistreatment over the years. I told her how she'd made me feel unwelcome in my own home, how she'd driven a wedge between me and my dad. Dad, hearing the commotion, came rushing in. He tried to calm me down, but I was too far gone. Through tears, I told him everything. How Melissa treated me when he wasn't around. How she made me feel like an unwanted guest rather than a member of the family. Melissa, of course, denied everything. She turned on the waterworks, playing the victim. She cried about how ungrateful I was after all they'd done for me. How she'd tried so hard to be a mother to me, but I'd always pushed her away. It was all lies, but she was convincing. Dad looked torn, his eyes darting between us, clearly not knowing who to believe. In the end, he told me to go to my room and cool off. As I stormed upstairs, I heard Melissa sniffling dramatically, saying how hard it was to deal with a troubled teenager, and maybe it would be best if I went to live with my mom for a while. I spent the night crying, feeling more alone than ever. The next morning, I overheard Melissa telling Dad that she really thought sending me to live with Mom might be the best solution for everyone. My heart sank. I hadn't heard from Mom in years, and now they wanted to ship me off to her? So here I am, feeling lost and scared. I feel like I'm losing my dad, the only parent who's been there for me. But I also can't keep living like this, feeling unwanted and mistreated in my own home. Should I reach out to Mom? Should I try to find somewhere else to go? I'm at a loss and I need advice. How do I handle this situation without completely falling apart? Update 1. It's been a month since my last post, and to say a lot has happened would be an understatement. First off, I want to thank everyone who commented and offered advice. Your support gave me the courage to take action and stand up for myself. After that disastrous birthday, things at home went from bad to worse. Melissa started pushing Dad more aggressively to send me to live with Mom. She'd make comments like, "Wouldn't Lena be happier with her mother?" Or, "Peggy should take responsibility for her daughter." It was clear she wanted me gone, and she wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. Dad, to his credit, resisted at first. I could see the conflict in his eyes every time Melissa brought it up. But she was relentless. She'd pick fights with me over the smallest things, leaving a glass in the sink, not folding the laundry exactly the way she liked, spending too much time in the bathroom in the morning. Then she'd run to Dad, complaining about how difficult and disrespectful I was being. It was like living in a pressure cooker, and I could feel myself about to explode. One night, about 2 weeks after my birthday, I overheard them arguing about me. I was supposed to be asleep, but I'd snuck downstairs to get a glass of water. Their voices drifted from the living room, and I couldn't help but listen. Melissa was insisting that I needed to go, saying she couldn't handle the tension anymore. "It's not healthy for anyone, Kevin," she said. "Lena's clearly unhappy here, and it's affecting the whole family. Maybe some time with her mother would do her good." Dad sounded tired, defeated. "I don't know, Mel. She's my daughter. I can't just send her away." But she's not happy here, Melissa pressed. And let's be honest, she's making life difficult for all of us. Zach and Maria are starting to act out because of all the tension. Is that fair to them? There was a long pause, and then I heard Dad sigh. Maybe you're right, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe it would be best for everyone. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Dad was giving up on me. After everything we'd been through together, he was ready to ship me off to a woman who'd abandoned us years ago. That's when I knew I had to do something. I couldn't wait around for them to decide my fate. The next day, while everyone was out, Dad at work, Melissa taking the kids to some activity or other, I started searching for information about Mom. It wasn't easy. We hadn't had any contact in years, and I didn't even know where she was living now. But eventually, after hours of searching social media and public records, I found her. I was shocked by what I saw. Mom had a whole new family. A husband who looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine, 2 picture-perfect kids, a big house with a pool. She looked happy, successful. All these years, she'd been living this great life while I struggled. It hurt, but it also made me angry. Why should I go crawling back to her now? As I sat there, staring at the photos of Mom's perfect new life, a memory surfaced. I remembered my Aunt Lisa, 41F, Dad's sister. We weren't close. She lived a couple of horrors away, and we only saw her on holidays. But she'd always been kind to me. Once, when I was about 12, she'd pulled me aside at a family barbecue and told me that if I ever needed anything, I could come to her. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it, but now it felt like a lifeline. With shaking hands, I found Aunt Lisa's number in Dad's old address book and called her. When she answered, I broke down. Through tears, I told her everything that had been happening: Melissa's treatment, Dad's passivity, the plan to send me away. She listened quietly, only interrupting to ask a few questions. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then Aunt Lisa said, "Lena, honey, I'm so sorry you've been going through this. You don't deserve any of it." Those simple words of validation nearly set me off crying again. Then Aunt Lisa continued, "Listen, if you need a place to stay, my door is open. I have a spare room and you're welcome to it for as long as you need." I was stunned. I'd hoped she might have some advice, maybe talk to Dad for me. I never expected her to offer me a place to live. "Are you sure?" I asked, hardly daring to believe it. "Absolutely," she said firmly. "You're family, Lena, and family takes care of each other." We talked for a while longer, making plans. Aunt Lisa lived in a city about 2 hours away. She said I could finish high school there. The school year had just started, so I wouldn't be too far behind. It wasn't ideal, leaving my friends and the life I knew, but it was better than staying in a home where I wasn't wanted or being sent to a mother who'd abandoned me. When I told Dad about my plan to move in with Aunt Lisa, he looked devastated. It was like he was seeing me clearly for the first time in months. He tried to convince me to stay, saying we could work things out, that he'd talk to Melissa. But I stood my ground. I told him I loved him, but I couldn't live with Melissa anymore. It was breaking my heart to see how she treated him and how he let her treat me. Melissa, of course, was thrilled when she heard I was leaving. She barely hid her satisfaction as I packed my things, making comments about how this was probably for the best. As I was walking out the door, she had the audacity to say, "I hope you'll be happier now, Lena. We tried our best." It took everything in me not to scream at her. Instead, I looked her in the eye and said, "No, you didn't. But I'll be okay despite that." I've been at Aunt Lisa's for 2 weeks now. It's been an adjustment, but it's so much better than before. I have my own room, decorated the way I like. Lisa treats me like family, not an inconvenience. We cook dinner together most nights, and she's teaching me to drive. It feels like I can breathe again. Dad calls every day, full of apologies and promises to make things right. I love him, and I know he loves me. But I'm not ready to go back. Not while Melissa's there. For now, I'm focusing on settling into my new school and healing from everything that's happened. It's not the life I expected, but for the first time in a long time, I feel hopeful about the future. Update 2. It's been 6 months since I moved in with Aunt Lisa, and my life has changed in ways I never could have imagined. I'm doing well in my new school. I've even made the honor roll. I've made some good friends, joined the school newspaper again, and I'm even thinking about college now, something that seemed impossible before. But the biggest change has been with Dad. About 2 months after I left, he showed up at Aunt Lisa's doorstep unannounced. He looked terrible, like he hadn't slept in days, with dark circles under his eyes and his clothes rumpled. When Aunt Lisa opened the door, he just stood there for a moment, looking lost. I was in the living room working on homework when I heard his voice. My heart started racing. Part of me wanted to run to him, but another part was still hurt and angry. In the end, I just sat there, waiting. Dad came into the living room, and when he saw me, his eyes filled with tears. "Lena," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." He told us that after I left, he finally opened his eyes to how Melissa had been treating me, and by extension, him. It was like my absence had lifted a fog he'd been living in. At first, he said, he'd tried to make things work with Melissa. He suggested couples counseling, thinking maybe they could learn to blend their families better. But Melissa refused, saying there was nothing wrong with her parenting style. As the weeks went by, her behavior got worse. She started demanding more expensive things, a new car, designer clothes, fancy vacations. When Dad said they couldn't afford it, she'd throw tantrums, accusing him of not providing for her like a real man should. She criticized him constantly, from the way he dressed to how he taught his classes. She even started flirting with other men in front of him, saying it was just harmless fun and he was being too sensitive if it bothered him. Dad said my leaving had made him realize how much he'd let slide for the sake of not being alone. He'd been so afraid of ending up like he had after Mom left that he'd ignored all the red flags with Melissa. The final straw came about a week before he showed up at Aunt Lisa's. Dad had come home early from work, not feeling well. As he approached the house, he overheard Melissa on the phone in the backyard. She was talking to a friend, laughing about how she'd finally gotten rid of the brat, meaning me, and now had Dad wrapped around her finger. She boasted about how easy it was to manipulate him, saying she'd have him buying her a beach house by the end of the year. Dad said hearing those words was like a bucket of ice water. All the little things he'd been trying to ignore suddenly came into sharp focus. He realized how much he'd compromised his own values and betrayed me in his desperation to have a complete family again. That night, after Melissa and the kids were asleep, he packed his bags and left. He'd been staying in a motel since then, trying to figure out what to do next. But he knew he needed to see me, to apologize and try to make things right. Dad broke down as he told us all this. He apologized for everything, for not seeing what was happening, for not protecting me, for letting his fear of being alone blind him to how unhappy we both were. He asked for my forgiveness and a chance to rebuild our relationship. I was wary at first. As much as I loved Dad, he'd hurt me deeply by choosing Melissa over me for so long. But Aunt Lisa encouraged me to give him a chance. She said, "People make mistakes, Lena. The important thing is that he's trying to make it right." So we started slow. Dad rented an apartment in the city and got a job at a local community college. We began having dinner together once a week, then twice. We talked, really talked, about everything that had happened. It was hard and sometimes painful, but it felt like we were finally being honest with each other. During one of these dinners, about a month after Dad showed up, I finally worked up the courage to ask about Mom. Why did she leave? Where did she go? Dad sighed deeply and told me the full story for the first time. It turned out that Mom had been struggling with depression for years, even before I was born. She'd hide it well most of the time, but Dad said there were periods where she'd barely get out of bed. She refused to get help, always insisting she could handle it on her own. The night she left, they'd had a big fight about it. Dad had found out she'd stopped taking her medication again and confronted her. He told her she needed to see a therapist, that he was worried about her and about me. Mom flew into a rage, accusing him of trying to control her, of thinking she was crazy. She stormed out, and that was the last time he saw her. So, Dad said he'd tried to find her in those first few months, hiring a private investigator and everything, but it was like she'd vanished into thin air. He eventually gave up, focusing instead on taking care of me. Hearing all this was overwhelming. It didn't excuse what Mom did, but it helped me understand a little better. It also made me realize how much Dad had been carrying on his own all these years. As for Mom, I finally worked up the courage to message her on social media. Her response was underwhelming. She said she was glad I was doing well, but made no attempt to meet up or reconnect. She didn't apologize for leaving or even acknowledge the hurt she'd caused. It stung, but it also gave me a kind of closure. I realized I didn't need her in my life to be happy or whole. These past few months haven't been easy, but they've been healing. I'm staying with Aunt Lisa until I finish high school. She's become like a second mother to me. Dad and I are talking about me moving in with him for my senior year, but we're not rushing anything. For now, I'm just grateful to have a stable, loving home and a chance to rebuild my relationship with my dad. Update 3. It's been a year since my last update, and I've just started college. Looking back, it's hard to believe how much has changed. I ended up moving in with Dad for my senior year of high school. It was an adjustment, but a good one. We both went to family therapy, Dad's idea, surprisingly, which helped us work through a lot of our issues. We're closer now than we've ever been. Living with just Dad again brought back memories of those years after Mom left, but in a good way. We fell back into our old routines. Sunday morning pancakes, movie nights where we'd critique the plot holes, long talks about books we'd both read. But there was a new openness between us too. We didn't shy away from the hard topics anymore. Dad really stepped up. He came to all my school events, helped me with college applications, and even learned to braid my hair for prom. It was a disaster, but the effort meant everything. When I got accepted to my dream school, he cried as much as I did. Melissa tried to contact Dad a few times after he left, alternating between tearful apologies and angry threats. Dad stood firm, telling her it was over. When she wouldn't stop showing up at his workplace, he got a restraining order. It was hard for him. I could see he felt guilty about how things ended, but he knew it was necessary. As for Mom, we've had minimal contact. She sent a generic congratulations card when I graduated high school, but that's about it. I've made peace with the fact that she's not going to be the mother I needed or wanted. It still hurts sometimes, but I've learned that family isn't just about blood. Aunt Lisa, who calls me every week just to chat, has shown me that. The biggest surprise came from Zach and Maria, my former step-siblings. They reached out to me on social media a few months ago. Turns out, Melissa wasn't a great mother to them either once Dad and I were out of the picture. They apologized for how things were when we lived together and said they missed having me as a big sister. We've met up a few times since then. It's been nice to reconnect without Melissa's influence poisoning everything. They're good kids, and I'm glad we can have some kind of relationship. We're not close, but we're friendly. They even came to my graduation party. I'm now studying psychology at college, inspired in part by everything I've been through. I want to help other kids who are struggling with family issues. Maybe someday I'll even specialize in helping families navigate divorce and remarriage. Dad drove me to campus and helped me move in. As we said goodbye, he hugged me tight and said, "I'm so proud of you, Lena. You're the strongest person I know." It wasn't an easy road to get here, but I'm proud of how far I've come. I'm excited for this new chapter in my life, knowing I have a solid support system behind me. Dad and I have plans for him to visit in a few weeks, and Aunt Lisa is already talking about Thanksgiving break. To everyone who's been following my story and offering advice, thank you. Your support meant more than you know. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that it's okay to ask for help, and that sometimes family is what you make it, not just what you're born into.